Hey everyone, I haven't done a video in a while. Just been really busy with SSBMRank, and one of the big things that a lot of people have been wondering as the content has been going on is who is the missing person, what exactly is going on. Because if you follow the rankings, I unveiled the ballots, the people who didn't make it into the top 100, and so there were 105 players, but we only went to 104. So you guys are wondering, well, what's going on, who's missing. So I want to go ahead and just talk about it right here. This is something that I've been thinking about for a while. And it's actually been a really difficult decision for me to actually make. So to give context, everyone's figured it out at this point. Mafia hasn't been ranked, and I ultimately came to this decision after long thought. This wasn't something I thought of right away and just went with it because I see both sides of the coin. And initially, I wanted to include Mafia on the SSBM rank, but I ultimately decided not to. And so I just wanted to show my initial kind of thought and then what led to my final decision. So initially I just thought to myself, well, SSBM rank reflects the records and the placements and your accomplishments of the prior year. And if we were to look at this criterion, Mafia would have made the top 100 easily. He had great wins, great placements, clearly a top 100 player. And I thought to myself, well, if you look at other forms of competition, as long as they do not cheat in the competition with steroids or some way, Game Genie or whatever, what they do outside of the game does not affect the player's accomplishments. So if a player in basketball, for example, has the record for most points in a game, whether or not he's a good guy, he still gets to keep that record. But then I thought about it some more, and ultimately what I was hoping was that SSBM rank doesn't necessarily endorse players' behavior outside of the game. I thought initially, well, hey, just because they're on this list doesn't necessarily mean we condone their behavior, whether it's positive or it's negative. And so I thought that, well, maybe that will stick. And then I thought about it some more. Well, this gets a lot of publicity and we honor the players, for their accomplishments. So unfortunately, implicitly, it is kind of a stamp of endorsement to players. If what they have done is public, then SSBM rank putting a player on in light of that does kind of have that implicit notion that it supports that kind of behavior. Now, of course, there's lines to be drawn. Ultimately, I don't like making these decisions. I've expressed kind of my dismay in these kind of things, ultimately because I never want to be placed in a situation where I'm the judge, jury, and executioner for different things. Ultimately, I would like these decisions to be made independent of me because for this decision, it was more in the black and white as opposed to being a more gray area issue. But if it was something that was a little bit more hazy, where the testimonies were even less clear, then ultimately I do not want to be the person that ultimately decides whether or not they get to be on the rankings if the decision's a lot tougher. Now, I know that there's going to be a lot of objections to this, and there's some consistency, questions that could happen. So we can say, well, if Mafia is banned, then what about if this situation happens? How would I respond to this? And ultimately, I do know that those concerns are very valid. I do want to create a system that's fair and consistent overall in the future. So I don't want to make these arbitrary, inconsistent decisions. And I just thought to myself for the longest time, well, okay, in Mafia's case, we kind of understand some precedents here, but what about like if we change some of the variables, then would Mafia still get banned if this happened, or if this didn't happen, or if she wasn't part of the community, or if she was? So these were all the questions I started to tackle, and I was like, okay, well, what about it? There's that underlying notion, well, what if the person is lying, or what if their testimony is not valid? So ultimately, the criterion I ended up coming up with that seemed to be pretty consistent, though it's subject to my scrutiny if it gets abused, is that if you are banned in your local region for anything sexual related or anything physically violent related, then at the time of the release of the rankings, then you are not going to be included in the rankings. And so looking at the prior history of this, and looking at all the cases where players have been banned for one of those two reasons, I think it's a pretty fair and consistent rule where it lays in the black and white as opposed to the grays. So I think it's pretty fair. Now, if there is ever a case where the testimony is very unclear or vague, or it seems like local community is out to get a person and it seems really unfair, then ultimately, yeah, I do have some say and I can make a judgment on top of that. But ultimately, I am pretty satisfied with using that as a criterion. Now, my only regret in all of this is not is that this was purely reactive. It's not a proactive thing that I stated in the beginning of the year. So in some aspects, I do recognize that's not really fair. In certain aspects, for me to bring this in after the fact, this character ruling, where in hindsight, I should have probably said that in the beginning of 2017 and said, well, hey, we want to honor and commemorate, our players, but we also want to make sure that we bring together values that ensure the safety of our members, that we feel that our environment is welcoming, that, if there are things that happen, there are consequences to it. And so, I do take full blame for this being a reactive ruling more than this being proactive. And a lot of people have asked me, I'm not going to, mention people by name. Well, what about people in the past? Well, unfortunately, our scene was a lot smaller back in 2013 and 2014. That this was something I hadn't really considered. So it's not one of those things where two wrongs make a right. So going forward, this is something that I think is a fair ruling. Of course, with Mafia's ban coming in the middle of 2018, and by the end of the year, by the end of this year, 2018, he will be eligible this year. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I do, just appreciate Melee, and I would just love to just play Melee, and I would love to see other people play Melee, and none of this drama would ever happen. But reality is, we're all people. Things happen, both good and bad, and we can only do our best to just encourage certain things in the community. So that's my ruling on this. Hopefully the mystery is now done and you guys can relax on the rankings countdown.